Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Sonny Franzese, an underboss of the Colombo family, whose life stretched across nearly a century of the Mafia's rise and fall. He was a man of contradictions, ruthless in business, yet smooth and charming in public. Bank robberies, loan sharking, rackets. Sonny built his reputation on both fear and respect. And through it all, he held fast to the code of silence that defined him. Before we dive in, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family, and let me know your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. Your like and subscribe truly motivate us to bring you more interesting stories from the underworld. Now, picture the glow of New York nightlife, the quiet deals whispered behind closed doors, and the shadow of a man whose loyalty to the Mafia endured longer than most men survive. Settle in, and let the story of Sonny Franzese guide you into the night. By his teens, he knew every doorway, every candy store where bets slid under the counter, every pool hall where numbers got called out in a whisper. He chased a few dollars carrying envelopes and learned not to read names on them. He dressed sharper than his income suggested, pressed shirts and polished shoes bought secondhand, but cared for like new. He liked music, good food, and conversation that trusted slow pauses. Friends said he had charm without trying for it. That made him welcome at tables where introductions mattered. Those rooms taught him about debt, loyalty, and why men did as they were told. The larger world exploded during the Depression, and then the war. But the lessons on those streets didn't change. He did his time in uniform briefly and came back home early, classified out for reasons that would be listed in paperwork but debated forever. What never changed was the way he stayed calm while others chased a moment. He wasn't a loud earner. He didn't boast. He handled bookmaking lines, small loans that grew into large ones, and protection arrangements that kept bars, diners, and little clubs from finding trouble. He never spoke of business in public. He leaned on habits. Never write what you can say. Never say what you can show with a gesture. Never let your temper dictate a move. It wasn't movie mythology. It was discipline. As the old Profaci crowd shaped what would later be called the Colombo family, his name climbed in quiet ways. He wasn't the biggest man in any room, but he had presence. Nightlife suited him, not because of neon, but because a lounge is a classroom if you listen. He had a booth in a few spots where entertainers dropped by after closing. He kept an eye on doorways, greeted owners with warmth, and made sure trouble ended before it started. Serious men noticed. In a life built on trust, he seemed like steel. That reputation was currency. Across the 1,950 seconds and into the early 1,960 seconds, he balanced two worlds. One held musicians, comedians, waiters, and promoters. The other handled unions, trucking routes, bars and restaurants, and the steady mathematics of cash. Authorities would later allege he touched loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and strong-arm collections. Those were staples of that era's underworld. He would deny violence whenever asked. Agents insisted otherwise. What is certain is that his influence widened, and his name moved closer to the top of the organization as leadership shifted from Profaci to Joseph Colombo and beyond. He was known for neat suits, soft steps, and a face that revealed nothing. He built relationships with people who managed clubs, recording studios, and distribution outfits. Some were legitimate, some were not. The line between them blurred at the edges of that time. When a venue needed an investor, he could connect one. When a promoter ran late on a promise, he could arrange a schedule that got kept. When a union vote looked tense, he could calm the room. Over and over, he prioritized steadiness. Even his critics admitted he didn't drink on the job. He didn't shout into phones. He refused to meet in obvious places. He liked a corner banquet where he could see the door, a cup of coffee cooling on the table, a jacket folded right at his side. He learned to end meetings early, leave without fanfare, and walk alone. It protected him for years. Law enforcement watched and waited. Surveillance teams wrote reports about cars idling too long, and men who didn't stay long enough. Investigators connected him to crews that handled weekly collections from bars, card games, and construction sites. The Bureau made him a target, leaning on informants who painted him as a senior figure. Headlines later would call him an underboss. He never corrected or confirmed the title. He just kept moving between spots where decisions got made after midnight. Then came the case that defined him for a generation. In the mid-1960s, a federal grand jury handed up an indictment, accusing him of orchestrating a string of bank robberies. He wasn't alleged to have been in the lobbies. Prosecutors said he coordinated people and resources from the shadows, a conspiracy charge built on witnesses who had turned, surveillance summaries, and a narrative about how money moved after the vaults were hit. He pleaded not guilty. He told anyone who would listen he had never planned such things, that the government was throwing everything at him because they couldn't nail him for rumors they couldn't prove. The trial stretched on. It wasn't a TV show. Jurors nodded off. Lawyers fought over small points. The press filed dry copy between more sensational cases. Yet in the back of the courtroom you could sense history pressing in. The government wanted a win. They got it. In 1967, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit bank robbery and received a sentence that sounded like the end of a life. The number marched across decades. He remained composed as marshals led him away. He would stick to that posture for the rest of his days. Prison tested him, but not the way movies show. He wasn't running a yard. He wasn't telling stories by a chain-link fence. He kept a schedule. Exercise, reading, visits when allowed, letters that never mentioned subjects that caused trouble. He did time in different federal institutions as the years rolled. He carried himself like a man who expected to walk out eventually, and in that belief he outlasted plenty who underestimated his patience. Staff respected his manners even when they watched him closely. Inmates learned he wasn't a gossip. He kept his head down and did not seek favors he couldn't repay. Before those doors closed behind him, his world had been clubs, suits, and the unspoken arrangements of a mid-century New York. By the time he saw the outside again on parole, the city had moved on. But his reputation hadn't vanished. The Bureau still considered him a leader with a reach beyond his years. Journalists wrote profiles that mixed fact and myth, painting him as a man who could glide from a studio back room to a street corner bakery with the same quiet ease. Friends said he loved old standards on the radio and didn't waste words. Agents said he still collected through intermediaries, that the old roots never died. He kept denying anything they couldn't prove. He had a family, and fame ran right through it. One son built a fortune in gasoline tax schemes during the 1,980 seconds, and later walked away from crime entirely, telling his story to schools and news programs. Another fell into addiction and later cooperated with the FBI, a choice that would shatter the house years down the line. Through all of it, the father maintained the same line. He never embraced betrayal, even when it cost him. That stubborn loyalty made him a hero to some, and a cautionary tale to others. It also kept him behind bars longer than most. Between releases and returns for parole violations, he lived like a man under a spotlight. Every restaurant could be a violation if the wrong person walked in. Every handshake could become a report from an agent in the corner. He was sent back more than once for seeing people he wasn't supposed to see, crossing lines set by conditions that didn't care about old friendships. He went quietly each time, refusing to argue in public. That earned him a reputation as one of the last old-school figures, someone who treated silence like a discipline rather than a strategy. During earlier years, investigators tied his circle to extortion of nightclubs, adult entertainment businesses, and small companies that couldn't afford to say no. Owners paid to keep doors open and trouble far away. He was accused of loans that turned heavy when payments fell behind, of gambling operations that ran smoothly because fear traveled ahead of collectors, of labor angles that steered contracts toward favored companies. Supporters countered that he was a gentleman who protected people he liked, the kind who made sure a singer got paid and a bartender got home safe. Both versions coexisted in the city's memory. The record shows charges, convictions, and long terms. It also shows endless rumors that never became counts on an indictment. He cultivated a certain elegance, even when his options narrowed. He ate simple meals, tipped well, and declined photos when strangers asked. He treated waiters with kindness and rivals with courtesy. He understood that image is armor. A well-cut suit can be a uniform that doesn't chafe. A soft voice can muffle the loudest accusation. He walked slow but never looked frail in the public's imagination until very late. His eyes gave away little. People projected their own story onto him. Some saw menace, some saw discipline, Some saw a survivor pulling dignity out of a life that often grinds it down. He was also very much a man of his time, molded by the New York that birthed him, the old waterfront, the garment center, the corner social clubs, the long, narrow restaurants where waiters balanced plates like art. He belonged to all of that. When the city lost some of those textures, he seemed to stand still, as if anchoring an era the rest of the world had decided to forget. That sense of permanence fed the legend. So did the fact that, despite countless investigations, no jury ever found him guilty of violence. Agents claimed he ordered it. He said he did not. In the court of public opinion, the debate never ended. Even his detractors admitted he wasn't reckless. He outlived rivals precisely because he didn't chase headlines or money he couldn't control. He valued predictability. He preferred a steady stream over a flashy score. That made him frustrating for law enforcement, who wanted a moment they could film and an explanation they could map. Instead, they got subtleties, a look that sent a man out the door, a phone that never rang, a meeting that ended before it started. The case that finally stuck conspiracy to rob banks was about planning, not performance. It sent him away for years and became the anchor of every profile written about him ever after. At night, years before that conviction, he would slide into a back room where a trio played and listen with his eyes closed. Friends said he loved the sound of a brush on a snare, of a bass line walking under a melody. He didn't drink much. He never stayed late. He carried the night's warmth like a secret on the walk back to his car. Those who knew him best say that was his favorite stage of the day. The quiet after the job, before the next call. When a man could pretend he was just another patron who happened to keep good posture. The city never stopped being his world even while he was locked away. On parole, he'd step into a diner he remembered from the 1,950 seconds and find it reborn with a new name and the same chrome trim. He'd fold his hands on the table, order coffee, and look like someone remembering a joke he wouldn't tell. Strangers tried to read him. They saw what they needed, a reminder of a past that haunted them, or a lesson in not talking when silence serves better. He didn't correct them. He didn't need to. Over many decades, he gathered labels underboss, gentleman, dinosaur, survivor. Some fit for a time and fell away. One stayed. A man who never broke his code as he defined it. He paid for that decision again and again, losing years to steel doors and bad mattresses while technology leapt forward without him. He believed that standing fast was the only way to be himself in a world that kept asking him to bend. Whether that belief was noble or stubborn depends on who is telling the story. What no one can dispute is how long his story ran, and how much of the city's hidden history runs right through it. He grew up when favors meant more than contracts, rose when a handshake could move freight across a river, fell when the law caught up with the old world, and walked out in a century that could summon a car with a tap. Through all of it, he held that same posture, that same careful nod, as if the rules had not changed at all. That is the paradox that keeps people talking about him, a man both fixed in time and strangely immortal within it. He saw the city again after long years, stepping out under a sky that looked the same and felt completely different. Neon was sharper, traffic louder, songs faster, and yet the sidewalk still carried the same hum he knew as a teenager. Parole meant rules on paper that controlled ordinary moments. A hug with an old friend could be a violation. A seat at a certain table could put him back inside. He adjusted with care. He found a barber who remembered the way he liked the sides, a tailor who took in a sleeve without asking questions, a small bakery that left a window cracked for the morning air. He measured time with patience. He knew law enforcement watched every move, every greeting, every smile. He kept his circle small and his afternoons quieter than the legend attached to his name. He rebuilt a rhythm without noise. Coffee at a corner spot, a short walk after lunch, late dinners with younger relatives who asked about the past and got stories about discipline, not drama. He still liked music, especially the kind that left room for breath. He would sit close to the bandstand, tap a shoe, and leave before the second set. At those tables, he met promoters and performers who knew his reputation long before shaking his hand. Some wanted protection. Others wanted advice. He kept the boundary clear. Polite talk, no promises, no grand speeches. He carried himself like a man who understood that what you don't say often matters more than what you do. That posture unnerved agents who had waited years to see him slip. Reports filled filing cabinets with small observations. The time he entered a restaurant, how long he stayed, who sat 2 stools away. Those files tracked allegations going back decades. Illegal gambling, loans at steep interest, union leverage that steered contracts, protection money collected from bar owners and club managers. Prosecutors believed he guided pieces on a board even when he seemed to sit still. Supporters said he was a gentleman who solved neighborhood disputes with calm, that he disliked bullies and wouldn't permit wild behavior. Both images followed him from block to block. The case that kept him labeled for years, the federal conspiracy to commit bank robbery, still shadowed every conversation. He had gone away on that conviction, telling anyone who asked that the government built it with turncoats and imagination. He lost years to it. Came home older, and faced a new kind of scrutiny. Parole trips back to custody for meeting the wrong person, sitting at the wrong table, or traveling without permission. Those returns didn't break his composure. He accepted the car ride, walked through intake like a man putting on a winter coat, and kept his routines. Officers who dealt with him remarked on his steadiness. He said little, caused no scenes, and waited for the door that would open again. Home meant family, and family was complicated. One son rose fast in the 1,980 seconds by exploiting fuel tax loopholes and creating a cash river that drew headlines. He later renounced that life and took to stages to warn others away from it. Another child fought addiction and eventually agreed to help the FBI, a decision that would reshape the father's later years. Through every turn, the older man held to a personal rule he had repeated since the 1,940 seconds: loyalty mattered, and loyalty had a cost. He accepted losses that came with living by that rule. He would not testify, would not trade information, would not point in any direction but his own. Admirers called that honor. Critics called it stubbornness. He called it who he was. The New York he loved kept changing. Clubs he once visited turned into condos. Union offices moved from storefronts to glass towers. The waterfront, where deals once happened, now hosted joggers and strollers. He adapted to those changes by keeping the essence of his life simple: a clean suit, a careful schedule, and the patience to let others talk first. He found comfort in old diners where the coffee tasted the same in a city that otherwise traded memory for speed. He tipped well, thanked ushers, and held the door for strangers. He understood how public image could serve as shield. A soft voice makes room for people to fill in the blanks with their own imagination. Investigators linked his circle to the same categories that defined mid-century organized crime: bookmaking that turned small bets into steady income, loans that looked friendly on day 1 and rigid on day 30, payments from club owners who believed a quiet arrangement kept chaos away, pressure around labor decisions where influence shaped who got on a job site. None of those allegations included vivid detail at his direct instruction in a courtroom. Many arrived through informants and flips looking for leniency. He denied directing harm. No jury ever convicted him of a violent count. The paper trail shows long surveillance, conspiracy charges, and years lost inside because the authority watched his associations like a hawk. He navigated those realities with the same measured grace that had carried him from his earliest days. He preferred a corner seat. He liked to see the door. He used the same careful nod to greet an owner he'd known since before television had color. He paid in cash, signed nothing unnecessary, and skipped photographs unless it was a family event. When police parked across the street, he chose not to change his route. He had decided decades earlier that fear wastes energy and invites mistakes. He believed in staying right-sized, living inside the version of himself he could control. Years blurred. He grew older while remaining central in articles and reports about a particular era of New York life that captured the public imagination. Journalists called him a bridge between the smoky nightclub age and the digital century. Former agents called him a master of keeping his hands off the paperwork. The public knew him from stories that leaned as much on tone as on documented fact. Somewhere between those interpretations stood the record: federal conviction for bank robbery conspiracy, repeated returns to custody for parole violations tied to association restrictions, renewed prosecution late in life for extortion. That late case brought him back into courtrooms with cameras clustered by the steps. Prosecutors said he used reputation and intermediaries to demand regular payments from Manhattan nightlife businesses, including clubs that traded not in romance, but in bright lights, booming sound, and expensive bottles. They played recordings captured by someone painfully close to him who had agreed to work with the FBI. Agents described a pattern. Collectors visiting managers, reminders delivered with smiles rather than shouts, weekly envelopes changing hands. His defense argued that age and ill health made the government's portrait untenable, that the case leaned on a son who had his own battles and reasons. The jury sided with the government. He was convicted of racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion counts, and received a sentence that would crush almost anyone else his age. He entered federal custody again, wearing dignity like a suit. He rose early, walked the track, read when he could, and treated staff with respect. He didn't dwell on the cameras or the headlines. Fellow inmates, many young enough to be his grandchildren, learned about a different time through his presence alone. He never lectured. He listened. He embodied a code that separated talk from action and an outlook that saw patience as a form of strength. Reports later said he became the oldest inmate in the federal system, a distinction that would make most people sad and left him quietly unbothered. He had dealt with worse than birthdays measured behind a fence. Inside, he received visits from people who still saw him as family first and legend second. They brought news of weddings, births, graduations, and small neighborhood joys. He asked about music, food, and whether certain bakeries had changed their recipes. He did not use those precious minutes to complain about prosecutors or replay the past. He let time do its steady work, day by day. He treated the calendar like a sparring partner who could be outlasted with calm and routine. That approach had carried him through earlier stretches, and it served him again. He came home again, astonishing the press with a simple fact. He reached his 100th birthday outside the wire. People had doubted he would breathe free air again. He stepped into the light as a centenarian and smiled for a few photographs, answering respectful questions with lines honed by decades of scrutiny. He spoke about family, gratitude, and the small pleasures of normal days. He did not revisit allegations. He did not try to correct the record. He let his survival do the talking. In a world that craves confession and spectacle, his refusal to deliver either looked like strategy, it was more like instinct. All the while, the conversation around his life kept circling the same themes. What he actually did, what was merely attributed to him, and how the city shaped the man who shaped parts of it back. On the record are serious crimes tied to conspiracy and extortion, a long sentence in the 1,960 seconds that influenced every year afterward, and a late-life conviction built on recordings and testimony. Also on the record is what did not happen. Despite whispers about bloodshed, no homicide conviction ever attached to his name. That gap between rumor and the courtroom became a central feature of his story. Some pointed to fear of retaliation to explain it. Others pointed to prosecutorial overreach in what they felt were shaky allegations. He carried that ambiguity like a shadow that never left his shoulder. He knew the cost of the life he had chosen long before the bills came due. Friends vanished to rivalries and investigations. Neighborhood haunts went dark. Family dinners felt different when place cards moved around the table by force of absence. He responded with a kind of quiet gratitude for what remained. A daughter's laugh, a grandson's piano recital, a relative's slow walk through a park where the trees remembered him better than the people did. For a man who spent decades on lists and in folders, those human details anchored him. Even critics noted that he didn't glamorize his past. He didn't hand out slogans or sell a myth. He never pretended that court dates, wakeful nights, and prison years were anything but the price of choices made young and reaffirmed often. He also didn't apologize for adhering to the principles he believed defined him: respect, steadiness, and keeping your word as you understood it. That mindset placed him among a dwindling group of old New York figures who seemed carved from oak. To many, he was the last of a particular breed, mannered, restrained, impenetrable. He passed through the city's long timeline like a marker you could steer by. Born when trolley bells still rang through Brooklyn, alive to hear smartphones chirp in restaurants where jukeboxes once glowed. He measured success not by headlines but by lasting. He endured. He became a yardstick for longevity in a world that often devoured its own. Whether you viewed him through the lens of law, culture, or folklore, you measured time by him. A child of immigrants who climbed a ladder barred to most, an underworld figure who figured out how not to be noisy, a father whose home held triumph and heartbreak in equal measure. Those threads produced a tapestry that kept journalists, agents, and ordinary onlookers staring. When he finally slowed for good, the city he helped define barely noticed. Cabs honked, subways rattled. A saxophone still cried from a basement music room, somewhere on the west side. He had outlasted the era of social clubs and backroom deals. He had seen the birth of laws designed to cage men like him, and the evolution of cases that mined wiretaps instead of bravado. His name remained in footnotes and feature stories, in documentaries that tried to separate fact from the fog of memory. People brought their own judgments to that name. Some saw menace held in a velvet glove. Some saw a code they wished still existed in other arenas. Promise made, promise kept. If you map the official record, you find it clear in places and blurry in others. It lists accusations of gambling operations, loans that tightened into control, labor influence that bent votes, and protection payments that flowed through nightclubs and small businesses. It records a major conviction for bank robbery conspiracy in the 1,960 seconds with a sentence that ran long. Multiple parole violations tied to restricted associations, and a final federal conviction for extortion that sent a man in his 90s back to a cell. It also logs the denials he repeated whenever microphones appeared. He insisted he was not the violent figure reports made him out to be, insisted the government chased reputation more than proof. The courts decided some questions against him and left others open forever. Standing at a window near the end, he looked out on a city that still moved to a rhythm he recognized beneath the new layers. Delivery trucks idled where pushcarts once creaked. Families argued and then laughed. Same as always. A young couple took a picture on a corner he had walked 1,000 times across 3 different lifetimes. That sight made him smile. The city wasn't kinder or harsher than before. It was simply the same machine with rearranged parts. He had learned how to live next to that machine, never letting the gears catch his sleeve, never pretending he could stop them. He learned to last. The lasting is the piece people forget when they talk about him as if his years were a movie. Movies end. He kept going. He wore consequences without theatrics. He let others narrate while he concentrated on the next step. That's why his tale stays with anyone who studies that period. It's the story of unwavering routine in a life surrounded by storms. Whether you admire or condemn him, you can't ignore the craft with which he lived, careful, deliberate, unyielding. He showed that in a world built on deals and pressure, a man who understands timing, silence, and posture can cast a long shadow without raising his voice. Before those late years turned reflective, the path that shaped him was already set, marked by small choices repeated with care. He learned early that real influence didn't announce itself. It showed up in quiet fixes, a landlord softened by a phone call, a shopkeeper introduced to a helpful accountant, a truck route that suddenly ran on time. His name started appearing in bureau memos during the 1,940 seconds as a man to watch around small gambling rooms and loan books. Those notes used phrases like steady earner and keeps discipline. People who dealt with him remembered the same things: polished shoes, clean cuffs, measured tone, eyes that weighed a room in seconds. The post-war city gave plenty of opportunity to someone who prized order. Saloons revived, card games returned to back rooms, union halls looked for leverage in contracts, and music poured through neighborhood clubs where singers tried to catch a break. He fit in across those spaces, without straining. Bookmaking brought dependable cash from bettors who preferred a familiar face over a public window. Short-term loans extended lifelines to bar owners and shopkeepers riding seasonal peaks and valleys, though interest climbed if promises slipped. He understood routes and schedules, garbage pickups, bakery deliveries, soda trucks, all the rhythms that make a city run. Those rhythms offered points of contact and moments to add a fee for keeping things smooth. He rose during the Profaci era and stayed steady through the power shifts that eventually produced the Colombo name. He wasn't a headline seeker. Others pursued notoriety or ran hot. He preferred long games. He valued 3 qualities in the men around him: punctuality, modest spending, and a willingness to listen more than talk. That standard built a reputation that reached upward. Older figures respected a younger man who didn't force his way into conversations. They entrusted him with errands that morphed into management of crews. Step by step, he moved from runner to overseer, from overseer to what agents later described as a top-tier role. On paper, he sold nothing. In rooms that mattered, he kept the calendar and the pace. Culture wrapped around that life. Jazz joints gave him privacy at crowded tables. A booth in the back let him sit with owners who needed cash for a renovation or a buffer against late-night trouble. He liked performers who respected craft and timing, the ones who hit a note cleanly and didn't overreach. That preference mirrored his own habits. He avoided flamboyance. He drifted out of rooms before trouble could find a target. He tipped well and remembered staff names. Managers paid for that calm orbit because it discouraged chaos, and chaos costs money. As the 1,950 seconds bled into the early 1,960 seconds, national attention shifted toward the underworld. Hearings pulled names into daylight, and celebrity trials made jurors out of tourists. He adjusted by getting even quieter. While some leaders courted cameras, he slid through side doors and let others claim the spotlight. He tightened his circle, cut loose anyone who couldn't control temper or drinking, and made sure he never appeared twice in a row at the same restaurant. The people watching him learned how patient he could be. Surveillance teams clocked him moving from a coffee shop to a barber shop to a short meeting in a parked car, then homeward. The reports grew thick with detail and thin on fireworks. That frustrated investigators. It also protected him. Stories about him sprouted and spread because myth loves a vacuum. One tale said a doctor had mangled his fingertips to keep prints off a crime scene. Another insisted he held secret stakes in films and clubs that drew long lines. He rarely bothered to confirm or deny. A few rumors were simply wrong. Others contained slivers of truth wrapped in exaggeration. He did know owners and promoters. He did extend cash to rooms that needed it, and sometimes guided contracts toward allies. But the silhouette always looked larger than any single act because the culture around him inflated legends while the man kept moving. The charge that reshaped his timeline arrived in the mid-1,960 seconds. A federal indictment positioned him as a coordinator behind a series of bank robberies executed by crews who specialized in planning, not improvisation. According to prosecutors, his role was never the front door. They said he matched people to tasks, managed logistics before and after, and ensured stolen cash moved through channels that scrubbed it of origin. He responded with a flat denial, calling the case a reach by prosecutors tired of failing to pin other allegations on him. The trial stretched over months. Witnesses included turncoats, former associates, and experts who mapped phone calls and travel patterns. He sat without fidgeting, a study in restraint. In 1967, the verdict landed against him guilty on conspiracy counts tied to the bank cases, and the sentence that followed was heavy enough to feel like a lifetime. The number spanned decades, a message meant for him and anyone else with his job description. He took it without spectacle. Marshals walked him out as they had walked others. He left a city shifting into a new age of policing, wiretaps, and prosecutors who had learned to build cases from paper and audio rather than eyewitness bravado. Inside, he treated time as material to work with. Exercise came first, reading next. He learned which parts of a prison day could be controlled and which had to be endured. He kept a small circle there too, men who disliked gossip, guards who appreciated a respectful tone, chaplains who valued a civil chat. He avoided complaints that solved nothing. Visitors brought the outside world in small doses. Music, news, family milestones. Headlines that said his name when a reporter needed to illustrate a point about an era. He did not present himself as a martyr. He did not seek pity. He behaved as if doing time was a job in itself, and jobs demand steadiness. Parole eventually opened a door in the late 1,970 seconds, and he stepped through with the same caution he used at nightclub exits. Conditions piled up like the fine print on a contract. No association with felons. No contact with anyone identified by last name on certain lists. Check-ins that sliced days into appointments. Territory restrictions that turned casual trips into violations. Those rules brought him back more than once. A dinner where the wrong person slid into a booth could trigger a summons. A friendly hello at a wake could put him on a bus headed to another intake. Each time, he kept the routine. He complied, did the paperwork, and waited for calendars to roll around again. Between those returns, he resumed the kind of influence that survives long absences. Men who had been young when he left sat across from him now wearing responsibility. They sought his take on disputes, splits in revenue, and which directions to avoid because attention had grown too sharp. He offered perspective more than directives. His theme never changed. Keep your voice down. Keep your records cleaner than your conscience. Keep your temper out of meetings. Law enforcement adjusted to his presence with renewed focus. Newer agents inherited old files that had been updated again and again with details about his movements and contacts. The narrative followed him like a shadow. Gambling lines under steady management. Cash loans that turned authoritative when borrowers wavered. Leverage and labor channels touching construction and entertainment. Influence over protection payments from nightlife venues. He denied ordering harm and reminded reporters that no court had convicted him of a violent act. The government countered that intimidation doesn't always leave bruises you can photograph. Family developments added fresh layers. During the 1,980 seconds, one son engineered a complex fuel tax scheme that used paper companies and out-of-state sales to siphon government money with astonishing speed. Headlines celebrated and condemned in equal measure. That son later rejected the life outright, became a public speaker, and addressed students about crime's cost. Another child, battling addiction, made headlines when he agreed to cooperate with the FBI, wore wires, and later took the stand against his father. Those choices tore through a personal code that had held steady since the 1,940 seconds. He responded without public theatrics, staying with a single refrain. Betrayal had no place in his world. He remained consistent, despite the emotional shock that would have rattled almost any household. By the 1,990 seconds and early 2000s, the landscape around the Colombo family had been altered by internal wars, long prison terms for top figures, and the broader pressure of federal racketeering tools that broke up structures once considered durable. He adapted by staying the same. Agents continued to describe him as an underboss, a counselor, a figure whose presence made rooms quiet. Allies described a gentleman who shook hands with waiters and kept schedules like a Swiss watch. Both descriptions could be true at once. In a life like his, posture and message were inseparable. The case that brought him back into court in the new century grew from long surveillance, cooperating witnesses, and recordings that captured conversations about weekly payments from Manhattan venues, places with velvet ropes, loud sound systems, and big tabs. Prosecutors framed it as classic extortion. Reputation plus visits slowed by smiles rather than shouts. Money in envelopes delivered on time. They added loans at severe rates and collection methods that let fear do the speaking. Defense lawyers argued that his age and frailty undermined any image of active orchestration and highlighted witness motivations. The jury sided with the government. He was found guilty of racketeering conspiracy and related counts, drawing a sentence that would have daunted a man half his age. Back in custody, he reclaimed his regimen. Wake early, walk, read, write short notes, treat people with courtesy. Officials noted he was older than any inmate they could remember. He faced that fact without complaint. Reporters called to ask what it felt like to be the oldest prisoner. He declined most interviews, preferring the quiet that had kept him safe inside and out. Fellow inmates studied him the way young musicians study old band leaders, not for flash, but for timing. He gave them little speeches, offered no recruiting lines, and dispensed advice mostly by example. One day after another passed under his shoes. Parole would set him free yet again, this time into a world that could barely process his age. He reached 100 outside prison walls, a benchmark that turned him into a curiosity beyond the underworld. Cameras returned for a few minutes. He said thank you, explained nothing, and went back to ordinary routines: coffee, a walk, a window seat. The past still clung to him, but he wore it lightly. People approached with their own versions. Law students eager to discuss case law, old-timers who remembered a night when he nodded to a bandleader and the song changed, young staff who only knew him from online clips. He gave each a polite moment and kept moving. Underneath the headlines and the folklore remains the core record. Authorities tied him to illegal gambling operations that transformed small wagers into steady revenue. They linked him to loans that started friendly and hardened with time, to pressure campaigns involving union influence around contracts, and to long-running arrangements where nightlife businesses paid regularly for protection from chaos. He denied physical coercion, denied signing off on damage, and kept repeating a line about the government constructing cases from stories told by men seeking lighter punishments. The courtroom history shows a major conviction in 1967 for bank robbery conspiracy with a long sentence, repeated returns to prison for violating association limits while on parole, and a late-life conviction for extortion and racketeering conspiracy that rested on recorded conversations, including material supplied by his own son. That's the framework scholars chart when they strip away gossip. He understood that legacy is a negotiation between fact and memory. He made almost no public effort to sway that negotiation. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't sit for long documentaries. He didn't try to soften his image or harden it further. He relied on the same tools he always had: composure, a neat suit, careful words, and a willingness to let others exhaust themselves guessing. In an age driven by confession and viral moments, his refusal to feed the machine felt almost radical. He believed silence would outlast the noise. He turned out to be right. The city around him helped write the last act. The old social clubs had shuttered. Unions had professionalized and digitized. Nightlife had rebranded itself as entertainment districts under bright LED walls. Yet in small ways, the old patterns persisted. A bar owner grateful for a little order, a promoter who preferred smooth nights over messy scenes, a worker who thought a handshake meant more than a contract. He represented that stubborn continuity. For admirers, he stood as proof that dignity could be maintained in any setting. For critics, he symbolized a system that taxed the vulnerable with fear and quiet approvals. He didn't argue with either camp. Behind closed doors, family scenes remained ordinary. Cake on paper plates, laughter around a table, a grandchild playing a phone video for a man who had grown up when radios glowed warm in the dark. He measured success in those moments, not in the legends that bore his name or the indictments that counted years. Age trimmed his circle down to essentials: health, coffee, music, and faces he loved. The past didn't vanish. It just took a seat in the corner and watched without interrupting. His story endures because it contains modern contradictions. He was a product of immigrant neighborhoods and hard times, who learned to manage chaos while insisting on manners. He was a defendant proven guilty of serious conspiracies, who nonetheless cultivated a public image that avoided spectacle. He was suspected of enabling violence while avoiding convictions that would settle the question forever. He embodied a code that many romanticize and others reject outright. All those elements live inside the larger saga of New York, a city that forgives almost nothing and remembers almost everything. What remains when you strip away romance is the design of a life built for survival in a world that rarely offers it. Wake clean, dress well, speak softly, leave early. Keep lists in your head, not on paper. Never borrow trouble. Pay attention to who enters a room last. Protect your reputation like currency. Never suggest, simply make it unnecessary for others to choose a different path. He didn't invent those principles, but he practiced them with an almost musical precision. That precision, more than any headline, explains why his name still finds its way into conversations about how power survives when it stops pretending to be loud. He understood how pressure travels through a city without raising its voice. A spoiled shipment, a late delivery, a truck that somehow can't find a loading dock until a manager returns a call. None of it dramatic, all of it effective. He didn't invent that style. He inherited it from older men who had survived longer than those who confused energy with discipline. By the late 1950 seconds, he had become a steward of that approach, a man who could stand still and make entire schedules move. In a landscape crowded with hustlers and heat seekers, he treated predictability as an art form. His days threaded through places where cash changed hands and conversations lasted just long enough. Jukebox routes, vending contracts, linen services, hauling companies, and small warehouses offered dozens of edges no one outside the business noticed. To a public that liked neat labels, he was tied to gambling lines, short-term lending at punishing rates, protection arrangements that kept nightlife tidy, and union influence that shaped who worked where and for how much. Those allegations didn't arrive as confessions on a stage. They came through surveillance logs, informants, cooperating witnesses, and inference. When asked, he dismissed the image. Prosecutors countered with charts. The truth, as always with him, lived in the tension between what could be proven and what everyone believed. He set a tone wherever he went. No ostentatious tables, no parades of cars, no boasts. He favored simmer over boil. He preferred businesses that generated modest amounts daily over long-shot jackpots. Bookmakers sent him numbers, not stories. Borrowers heard friendly terms early and rigid ones later. Club owners paid for calm, not chaos. In interviews years later, agents described those systems as old machinery quietly spinning, lubricated by fear and by a reputation big enough to do the speaking. He let that reputation do exactly that. When the 1,960 seconds swelled with television hearings and magazine features about organized crime, he made himself scarce. Public crusades were for other names. He adjusted routes, cut meetings, and told lieutenants to take the long way around. He liked rooms where music floated above low conversation. He met owners late, spoke briefly, and left before anyone could decide they had seen him. His habits were not superstition. They were survival techniques learned in a world where cameras were multiplying and patience was a vanishing commodity. He kept his. Then came the federal case that rewrote his calendar. In 1966, a grand jury accused him of orchestrating an interstate series of bank robberies. The charge didn't picture him with a mask or a sack. It cast him as a planner who placed people and resources so the crews could work, then managed the cleaning of money afterward. He insisted he had never directed such a string. He called the case a net thrown wide after years of frustration. Trial transcripts filled with witnesses, robbers turned cooperators, associates hoping to shorten their own time stacked their claims. The government persuaded a jury in 1967. He was convicted of conspiracy and handed a term that sounded like a chisel carving stone. He walked into prison with the calm that had baffled observers since his teens. He treated incarceration as a regimen: wake, walk, read, keep company with men who threw away less than they kept. Avoid arguments that solve nothing. Officers noted he was polite without pretending friendship. He processed each day as a unit to be completed. Visitors brought scraps of the city: a new club opening, a bakery changing hands, a nephew learning an instrument. He listened. He kept his remarks sparse. He didn't bite on the lure of revisiting the trial. He had made his denial. He didn't plan to refine it. When parole came at the end of the 1,970 seconds, he returned to a New York reshaped by laws and tools designed to map the private world he had perfected. Title III wiretaps and the RICO statute changed the ground beneath everyone's feet. Conversations that would once have evaporated now lived on tape. Conspiracies could be assembled from patterns rather than single events. He adjusted by becoming even more careful. He avoided gatherings that felt like déjà vu. He didn't use the words the headlines loved. He preferred coffee counters and walks at odd hours over social club routines. Even so, parole restrictions had their own gravity. Those rules prohibited contact with anyone on long lists. A handshake could send him back. That happened more than once. Each return looked the same from the outside. A quiet re-entry, a re-established routine, and no complaint for anyone to quote. His name retained currency in the art, nightlife world. Owners sought him not for glitter but for peace. They believed his orbit discouraged storm clouds. Investigators believed that orbit channeled money upward. Weekly envelopes from clubs, percentages skimmed from big nights, interest payments from loans that had turned heavy. They saw a structure with him near the top. He said the government read meaning into ordinary hospitality. Neither side ever satisfied the other. In the middle sat a man who kept his voice low and his schedule clean. The 1,980 seconds brought family plot lines that would outshine anything on tape. One son leveraged fuel tax loopholes to build a fortune that put him in headlines coast to coast. That boom ended in convictions, a broken spell, and a complete pivot. Speeches, books, and a public renunciation of the life. Another son battled addiction, and then, after years of struggle, became a cooperating witness for the government. He wore recording devices, captured conversations, and later testified against his father in a case that would return the older man to court well into his 90s. The personal weight of those turns is hard to overstate. He answered them in public with the same sentence he had used for decades. He rejected betrayal on principle, regardless of cost. He did not debate his children in newspapers. He folded himself back into the steady habit of showing no reaction. While all of that unfolded, the family he belonged to endured wars, indictments, and prison terms that rearranged its leadership. He was always listed by agents as senior figure, underboss, counselor, labels he never publicly confirmed. He occupied a familiar tier, high enough to be watched relentlessly, low enough in profile to avoid the daily spotlight. He saw the old storefront clubs close, watched the waterfront modernize, and kept to a code that looked anachronistic to younger men drawn to loud cars and brighter rooms. He told them the same thing older men had told him. Attention is expensive. Restraint pays a dividend. The late-life case that prosecutors built against him depicted a familiar pattern translated into modern venues. Investigators said managers of Manhattan night spots paid regularly for the privilege of smooth operations. They asserted that loans came with steep terms and collection teams that never needed to raise their volume. They played recorded snippets in court conversations with intermediaries, phrases vague and vague, silences that seemed to drown entire sentences. The government argued that the meaning of those laconic exchanges was unmistakable if you knew the context. The defense emphasized age, health, and motive, reminding jurors that key recordings came from a son with his own battles. The verdict came in 2010. He was found guilty of racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion. The sentence, handed down in early 2011, sent a nonagenarian back into custody. He took the ride with the same posture he had shown in 1967. Inside, he kept to routine, becoming, according to press accounts and prison records, the oldest inmate in the federal system for a time. That distinction interested everyone but him. He cared about a morning walk, a decent cup of coffee, a letter that mentioned music. Younger prisoners studied his quiet as if it were a skill to learn. He didn't teach a class. He didn't glorify a life that had cost him years. He demonstrated a way of carrying time that made it lighter than it appears in court documents. Release arrived almost like a dare to the calendar. He came home in his 100th year, a milestone that pushed his name onto news scrolls one more time. Cameras found him for a minute. He gave them thanks, declined to take the bait on old allegations, and returned to small pleasures. Family brought cake to a table where jokes traveled faster than grievances. Friends of friends stopped by to say they'd heard stories for decades and never expected to offer congratulations on a birthday with 3 digits. He smiled, shrugged, and asked whether the bakery had changed owners. The past often tried to pull him back. He kept walking forward at an unhurried pace. For those who catalog such lives, the record is both narrow and weighty. On the books are the bank robbery conspiracy conviction from the 1,960 seconds with a long sentence attached, repeated parole violations for association that sent him back and forth between home and custody, and a final racketeering conspiracy and extortion conviction in 2010, grounded in taped conversations and witness testimony. Surrounding that triangle are persistent allegations, illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, night spot protection schemes, labor influence that define that era's playbook. He denied violence whenever asked. Investigators insisted intimidation was the point. No homicide conviction ever landed on his file. That void became as much a part of his public identity as the counts that stuck. The friction between what courts decide and what culture believes made him a recurring subject for documentaries and long magazine features. Writers tried to unpack how a man could be so central to a story without leaving confessions behind. Former prosecutors explained how the law changed mid-career, turning whispers into wiretap exhibits and loose crews into RICO charts. Old friends spoke about kindness in small moments. A bill lifted from a table before a busboy could worry. A ride offered on a rainy night. A look that dissolved an argument. None of that erased the heavy parts of his record. It did, however, render him human, in a narrative that often trades in caricature. Across the decades, he kept the same micro-rituals. He sat with his back to the wall. He scanned exits without seeming to. He folded napkins into neat squares. He arrived 5 minutes early, and left 5 minutes before a meeting's natural end. He said people's names when he greeted them and did not repeat them later in places that might echo. Those habits didn't make him invulnerable. They made him durable. There's a difference. He never pretended otherwise. The city that shaped him left marks you could trace with a finger across a map. Waterfront piers, garment district loading docks, little bars that survived 3 rent hikes, music rooms that kept the lights low. He knew the people who made those places work. He listened more than he talked. He understood when an owner really needed help and when someone simply wanted proximity to a name. That discernment is a skill as valuable in legitimate business as in the world where he built his reputation. It kept his circles from collapsing under the weight of favors that cost more than they paid. The longer view shows a man who moved with care through one of the most scrutinized subcultures in American life, left a footprint large enough to fascinate, and nonetheless avoided the kind of theatrical ruin that often closes such stories. He didn't stage a redemption arc. He didn't publish a memoir. He didn't air grievances against prosecutors or former allies. He simply lasted, carrying the consequences of his choices and the benefits of his discipline in the same steady manner. For some, that endurance is the lesson. For others, it's the cautionary note. A life that exchanged freedom in short bursts for devotion to a code that didn't bend even when bending might have saved years. He died in 2020 at 102, a number that seems almost impossible in a line of work with such a short average run. He slipped away with a few headlines and a cluster of reminiscences from people who had watched him walk out of courthouses and restaurants for half a century. The legal record remained the legal record. The stories remained stories. Between them stood a man whose quiet shaped both. In the end, the details fit into a pattern he had demonstrated since he was a young runner with a polished pair of shoes. Speak less, control what you can, outlast the noise. He built a life out of small calculations that added up to something large enough to bend a room. A knock at the right door, a pause long enough to let someone reconsider a mistake, a reminder delivered with courtesy instead of bluster. He trusted those tactics more than any threat. The men who mentored him in the 1,930 seconds taught that a steady reputation moves money and people better than heat ever will. He carried that lesson from candy stores to supper clubs to union corridors and never dropped it, even when the era around him changed from paper ledgers to tape recorders and then to digital files that fit in a pocket. He grew up in a city that spoke in errands, a bookmaker's sheet folded into a newspaper, a driver who knew which alley to avoid, a bartender who kept his eyes off the door and on the glasses. Each detail became a note in a song he could conduct without standing up. The jobs people linked to his name were the jobs that defined organized rackets for half a century. Illegal betting parlayed into weekly envelopes, short-term loans that turned firm the moment a borrower drifted, arrangements with club owners who preferred order to accidents, and influence around labor where a nod swayed which crews arrived at dawn. Agents wrote it down as gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and labor racketeering. He brushed that off in public and met the next morning as if the allegation itself were background noise. The public record shows that he served briefly during the war before being discharged, returned to Brooklyn, and took up the quiet craft that would shape his life. He didn't run with volume. He wore dignity like a uniform, pressed suit, clean shoes, a smile that never tried too hard. He liked the corners of rooms, the places where you can monitor the door and the temperature of a crowd at the same time. In those corners, he met owners who needed cash and calm. He offered both with a tone that told them he expected to be treated with the same respect he showed. Music wrapped around those years like a shield. Clubs offered a kind of cover, crowded but not chaotic, loud enough to discourage eavesdropping, intimate enough to pass a message with a nod. He favored the places that ran smooth and valued rhythm over spectacle. Singers and comedians learned his name and treated him like a patron who could solve problems. Some stories claim friendships with famous performers. Others say he simply maintained a wide circle of acquaintances. He never clarified. He liked that rumors did work for him he never had to do himself. As the 1,950 seconds matured, New York entered a boom in both business and surveillance. Politicians promised crackdowns. Newspapers ran features on a hidden world that didn't consider itself hidden at all. He responded by getting quieter, not louder. He refused to repeat routes, shortened meetings, and reminded anyone who worked near him that impatience is more fatal than caution. If a police car idled near a cafe, he finished his coffee, tipped, and walked out as if the scene were ordinary, which to him it was. He knew that rumor thrives on drama. He starved it. The government's most durable case against him came out of that decade's turn. In the mid-1960 seconds, prosecutors alleged he occupied an organizing seat in a network behind a string of bank robberies. Their portrait placed him well away from any counter or vault, crediting him with choosing crews, arranging logistics, and seeing to the distribution of proceeds afterward. He pleaded not guilty. In court, he sat with a stillness that reporters remarked on, while the government brought in cooperating witnesses who described planning sessions and after-action routines. The jury convicted him of conspiracy in 1967. The sentence, decades, looked designed to draw a line under an entire style of leadership. He entered prison with his code intact and adapted to the schedule without complaint. Days became units to be finished one at a time. He kept himself fit, read, and chose companions with the same care he used on the outside. Staff noticed that he didn't test boundaries for sport. He didn't pretend to be a philosopher or a boss behind the walls. He behaved like a man who believed he would walk out again, and understood he had to protect that possibility from his own worst impulses. Visitors brought small stories from home cakes from a bakery, still using a recipe from the 1940 seconds, a cousin's wedding, a new club drawing crowds in Midtown. He listened and placed each detail on the mental map he never stopped updating. When parole finally opened the door in the late 1970 seconds, the city he re-entered had been rewired by law. The new statutes treated patterns as evidence and conversations as exhibits. Association restrictions stamped onto parole conditions meant that basic social life could trigger a return. He encountered that reality more than once. A wake where an old acquaintance took his hand could end with a hearing and a bus ride. He didn't argue the irony. He learned the terms and lived inside them as best he could, then accepted the consequences without theatrics when a line got crossed. That cycle of release and recall did not erase his standing. Owners still valued a steady presence that discouraged disruptions. Younger men still sought him out for advice on avoiding attention and stabilizing businesses that printed cash after midnight. Agents continued to update files with dates, times, and companions. The allegations remained constant. Illegal betting overseen with care, cash lent on terms that hardened if deadlines were ignored, weekly payments from nightlife that bought a version of calm, and influence in labor that steered outcomes. He continued to deny harming people and pointed to a record free of violent convictions. Authorities countered that intimidation manifests in silence, not scars. The household he built carried its own drama. One son found a way to exploit fuel tax loopholes in the 1980 seconds, creating a money rush that fascinated reporters and drew the full focus of federal investigators. That same son eventually disavowed the life, spoke publicly about the cost of it, and made a living telling audiences not to chase what he once chased. Another son lost years to addiction, and then chose to wear a wire, meet with agents, and help them record conversations that would be played in a later courtroom. That second son testified against his father. The emotional weight of those events defies easy explanation. The older man refused to turn his distress into a public campaign. He repeated the same line to anyone who asked. Loyalty, as he defined it, mattered more than survival. The larger organization he belonged to, the one journalists label with a family name, went through wars and restructurings driven by arrests, betrayals, and long sentences. He navigated those years with the same low profile that had kept him intact before. Agents called him an underboss, a counselor, a veteran whose presence cooled a room. He neither confirmed nor denied. He never seemed interested in a title that could be printed under his picture. The late-life case that brought him back into a spotlight aimed at bottle service clubs instead of smoky lounges. Federal agents alleged that he and others collected regular payments from venues that wanted smooth operations, offered loans at harsh terms, and let reputation take the place of open threats. They cited taped conversations provided by informants and a cooperating witness whose last name matched his own. Jurors heard phrases that meant little without context, and everything with it. The defense argued that age turned the government's picture into a stretch, and that witnesses had motives that clouded their stories. The jury convicted him of racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion. The sentence put a man in his 90s back in federal custody. Inside again, He resumed the routine that had once carried him through, this time with the added curiosity of being the oldest inmate anyone could remember. Days still had to be finished, and he finished them. Morning walk, a book in the afternoon, a letter answered with a sentence or two. Kindness to staff who treated him fairly. He didn't give speeches about honor or make converts. He showed younger men what discipline looks like when the incentives not to bother are overwhelming. Release came when even supporters wondered if he would ever see the open street again. He reached 100 on the outside, and did it with the same quiet that had defined his first 20. Cameras appeared for a day and drifted away. He took calls, accepted congratulations, and refused to revisit old charges or offer new quotes for the sake of a headline. He wanted coffee at a table by a window, time with family, and a city he could watch move while remaining just out of its reach. His legacy sits at the intersection of court transcripts and recollections. On one side are hard entries, the 1,967 bank robbery conspiracy conviction, with a sentence that consumed years. The repeated parole violations tied to associations that sent him back. The 2010 racketeering conspiracy and extortion conviction that relied on recordings and the testimony of a son. The fact that he lived past 100 and was still under watch when most of his contemporaries had vanished from public files. On the other side are stories some corroborated, some not, about a man who solved disputes with calm, tipped every time, kept tempers from turning rooms upside down, and believed that elegance was armor. That tension between punitive record and persistent mystique helps explain why his name still brings writers back to the same table. Look closely at the way he handled pressure, and you see a system anyone can understand even if they reject it. He never confused speed with success. He considered arrival times, learned when to leave, and defended habits that had saved him more than once. He stored names and dates in his head instead of on paper. He kept a circle cut to fit his own patience. He made himself a poor source for gossip and a reliable source for stability. Those methods do not excuse the damage done by the rackets attributed to him. They do, however, explain how he lasted while others burned. It's also true that the city molded him as much as he molded it. The docks where workers once lined up at dawn, the garment racks that rolled across side streets, the clubs that made Wednesday nights feel like Friday, he watched those places rise, fall, and sometimes return as something else. He acclimated without letting the core of his approach drift. He stayed polite. He stayed private. He stayed attuned to how money moves in the seams between legal and illegal enterprise. That middle ground is where his story lives, not in cinematic showdowns, but in the daily management of risk and reward. He didn't chase the last word. He left that to prosecutors, critics, admirers, and family members who told their versions. He accepted that a life like his would be argued over long after he stopped taking calls. He valued being remembered on his own terms more than being loved. Those terms were simple. Respect people who deserve it, keep your promises as you understand them, and don't dress fear up as ambition. Whether those rules look like integrity or stubbornness depends on who's telling the tale. He died in 2020, past 100, after outlasting nearly every peer and much of the era that created him. The record remains: serious convictions, long sentences, and a final chapter written in court, with help from a son who chose cooperation over blood ties. The myths remain too: whispers about friendships with stars, rumors about extreme precautions, tales of a gentleman who made chaos step aside. In between stands a man who walked softly through a loud century and left footprints large enough that people still argue over their shape. He learned to read a city's pulse the way a pianist feels for tempo before a first note. The sidewalks had rhythms: morning deliveries, mid-afternoon lulls, late-night rushes. He kept pace without jostling, always a half step to the side of the crowd. That small offset was a choice. It let him see trouble coming, and let trouble overlook him. Decades after his first errands, that habit still defined him. He didn't fill rooms with volume. He adjusted angles, smoothed frictions, and left people believing they had solved their own problems. In neighborhoods where solutions were often noisy, his quiet felt like a luxury. Work in that world hinged on routine. Bookmaking lines closed at a set hour. Runners made drops on a repeating loop. A loan due on Thursday didn't become a negotiation on Friday. The businesses that leaned on him, bars, dance rooms, small companies that relied on clean nights, paid for predictability. That was the commodity he sold better than anyone. Authorities labeled it differently: gambling offenses, usurious lending, protection rackets, leverage around labor votes. However framed, the core was stability in a place that rarely offered it free. He came of age with men who treated dignity as currency. They taught him to show up on time, keep clothes clean, and let others talk themselves out of mistakes. He remembered names, asked about families, and kept lists in his head. A neat life leaves few traces. That ethos carried him through power shifts, as the Profaci organization became the Colombo family, through periods when agents typed his name at the top of memos as a senior figure suspected of running crews and advising leadership. He never confirmed a title. He didn't have to. Rooms got quiet when he walked in. You can measure his years against the tools used to chase him. In his early days, agents followed cars and wrote notes in cafes. Later, microphones entered the picture. Then came statutes that stitched patterns into conspiracies. He adapted at each turn. He shortened meetings, changed routes, and cut ties with anyone who mistook speed for craft. He never accepted a call he could avoid. He never held a meeting he could split into two shorter ones in different places. Caution shared widely becomes a culture, and for a long time that culture insulated him from the worst outcomes. The major exception remains the federal conviction in 1967 tied to a conspiracy behind a string of bank robberies. Prosecutors told a story about logistics, planning, and the movement of money. They said he matched people to roles, managed timing, and helped scrub proceeds of origin. He said the case was built on people looking to save themselves. A jury believed the government. The sentence spanned decades. He wore it like he wore everything else, as if upset were wasted effort. He went where they sent him, and turned time into structure, exercise, reading, conversations that never wandered into areas that caused problems, and a veneer of civility that softened even the hardest institutional edges. Parole brought him back to a city that had tightened laws and loosened its tolerance for old arrangements. Restrictions followed him like a shadow. Association rules meant that a chance encounter could trigger a violation. He crossed those lines more than once and returned to custody each time without performance. The cycle could have turned another man bitter. He treated it as weather. You prepare, endure, and wait for it to pass. Meanwhile, you maintain yourself. His family's arc ran in parallel. One son became famous for financial schemes in the fuel business in the 1,980 seconds, then renounced that life and turned to public speaking about consequence and reform. Another child, battered by addiction, made the painful decision to cooperate with the government and later testified against his father. Those facts sit in the record and in magazine pieces that tried to grasp how a house built on loyalty could sustain that fracture. He answered it his way, the same way he had answered every test since boyhood. He didn't talk. He didn't explain. He carried on with the code that had kept him intact, even when it kept him inside. Between those personal shocks, he managed the long tail of a reputation. Journalists wrote profiles that called him the last of a certain breed. Former prosecutors called him a lesson in how to run without sprinting. Agents said he still coordinated gambling routes, loan collections, and steady payments from nightlife businesses that preferred calm to surprise. Supporters said he facilitated order more than he enforced it, that owners slept better when his orbit overlapped theirs. Both sides found evidence they considered persuasive. None of it changed his method. He expressed taste in small ways. He liked a quiet booth with a clear view. He preferred a plate of simple food over giant meals. He tipped everyone, valets, waiters, door captains, like they might someday be the last person to see him safe to a car. He gave the same courtesy to rivals he considered professionals. If tempers rose, he left. If a place drew too many cameras, he moved on. If someone at a table started to talk like a movie character, he stopped taking their calls. The habits sound small. They kept him from becoming a headline before the law decided to make him one. The 1,990 seconds wrecked the old order with wars inside his organization and long sentences for many of its leaders. He witnessed that upheaval partly from cells and partly from a handful of careful years outside. He stayed above the street's daily quarrels and below the levels of visibility that had torched others. Agents insisted he remained underboss material, an elder statesman with real sway. He didn't correct them, because he didn't acknowledge the labeling at all. He recognized that words are hooks you hang yourself on. What brought him into a courtroom again near the end was an updated version of the same allegations that had shadowed him. Payments from Manhattan venues that wanted smooth operations, loan terms that turned strict when borrowers drifted, and collections conducted with calm rather than chaos. This time, the proof included recordings gathered by informants and by a son who had chosen the government's side. Jurors listened to lines that meant little to outsiders, and a great deal in the coded speech of his world. They returned guilty verdicts on racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion. A federal judge sent a man in his 90s back behind a fence. He did not flinch. He stepped into a routine he knew by heart and became, for a time, the oldest inmate in the federal system. The fact interested reporters. It did not interest him. He wanted a clean cell, a walk under a sky he could still call blue, a few pages that carried him from lunch to count. Officers who dealt with him rarely had complaints. Younger prisoners saw a reliability that didn't require speeches. He modeled steadiness. Some learned from it, others simply watched, and that was enough. Release, when it finally arrived, turned into a small civic marvel. He reached 100 outside, posing briefly for cameras that asked the same questions he had sidestepped for half a century. He responded with gratitude, declined to revisit the past, and resumed the manageable pleasures of very old age: family dinners, coffee by a window, a stroll that counted each step like a gift. The city swirled around him, louder and faster than ever. He still walked a half pace off the crowd. Pick apart the record, and you find three anchors that historians return to: the 1,967 conviction for bank robbery conspiracy, with the heavy term that followed; multiple returns to prison for violating the association rules that governed parole; and the late-life racketeering conspiracy and extortion conviction powered by recordings and a cooperating witness inside his own family. Around those anchors are widely reported allegations: illegal betting operations, loans that tightened into control, influence around labor in specific sectors, and regular payments from nightlife and adjacent businesses that he denied directing as prosecutors described. Notably, for all the rumors about bloodshed that cling to men of his rank, no court ever returned a violent conviction against him. That fact does not settle every argument. It does define one boundary of the official file. He also carried folklore that no court could settle: claims about filed fingertips, tales about music industry investments, whispers about long friendships with celebrities, stories about a gentleman who did not curse or drink on the job and expected the same restraint from his circle. He let those stories circulate without help from him. He understood that myth serves even the men it cannot fully describe, and he understood the cost. Myth draws attention, attention attracts pressure, and pressure must be answered with discipline, or it crushes you. Walk through the parts of the city he favored, and you can still find places that remember him without saying his name: a back table near a stage, where a trio rehearses a standard; a bakery where the morning line forms early, and the staff slides a small extra into the bag for an old regular; a diner where the coffee tastes the same in every decade. Those are not glamorous fixtures. They are human ones. He would have told you that durability matters more than glamour. His entire existence is a footnote to that claim. He had opinions about younger men in his world. He respected the ones who kept records clean, spent modestly, and avoided the pose of cinematic crooks. He disliked the splashy, the impulsive, the careless. He would say in his way short, quiet, that attention invites costs you cannot calculate. He would add that real power expresses itself in predictability. Clubs need that, crews need that, families need that. The lesson sounds simple. It is not easy to live. He lived it past 100 years. The end came gently in 2020 after a run that spanned trolleys and rideshares, jukeboxes and streaming playlists. He left behind court files, surveillance logs, news clippings, and a collection of personal memories that don't make it into archives. A laugh at a table when a joke landed perfectly. A tilt of the head that released tension in a room. A hand on a shoulder that signaled everything was fine now. Those moments don't excuse the harm that came with the systems aligned to his name. They complicate the picture, which is closer to truth than any single angle. What remains useful about his story is not an argument for or against him, but the demonstration of how habits decide fate. He practiced patience like a craft. He measured speech the way a careful chef measures salt. He invested in routine when others invested in bravado. Those choices kept him upright through eras that destroyed men faster than prison ever could. They also kept him entangled with laws designed to disrupt networks that thrive on quietly transferred obligations. He knew all of that and chose his way anyway. He never chased a closing line. He didn't try to outtalk prosecutors or outright journalists. He accepted that reputation is a tide you can ride but not own. He looked after small details of presentation, and those details took care of him more reliably than any flashy defense ever would have. He valued the next day over the last word. When people ask how he lasted, that's the answer hiding in plain sight. He treated tomorrow like a job worth keeping, and today like a shift he had to finish, no matter how many headlines tried to draft him into a different story. He never pretended the world he moved through was fair. He just believed it could be managed with a steady hand. That belief took shape in the years when New York still ran on handwritten ledgers and favors folded inside newspapers. By the time the skyline bristled with glass, he still relied on those older lessons. Stay polite, travel light, avoid showmanship, and let your reputation carry messages your mouth never has to say. People read him clearly without hearing much at all. Law enforcement adapted around him, and the adaptation tells you as much about his longevity as any profile. In the late 1950 seconds, after a gathering upstate forced national attention on an underworld many leaders insisted didn't exist, federal investigators built programs that mapped suspected figures by neighborhood, business, and family name. His file thickened during those years. Agents annotated sightings, recorded license plates, and sketch.org charts that placed him near the center of one of the city's 5 entrenched organizations. Those charts were working theories, not verdicts, but they influenced every knock at his door thereafter. He became a priority target under initiatives that treated consistent patterns as proof of reach. Inside the economy he actually touched, the tools were ordinary. Linen routes that serviced restaurants, vending machines that needed placement, delivery schedules that could be smoothed or snarled, betting lines that turned paydays into a drip of house percentages, small loans that gave a lifeline one week and leverage the next. And the club's first music rooms and lounges, later high-volume nightlife, where owners prized calm above all else. In the language of prosecutors, that set translated into illegal gambling, loans at punishing rates, extortion framed as protection, and labor influence that shaped who got the lucrative shifts. He understood those labels. He also understood how to operate so that accusations outpaced admissible evidence. Changes in the law made his caution essential. Wiretaps turned muffled hunches into transcribed exhibits. The racketeering statute let prosecutors knit scattered acts into a single narrative that could put senior figures in a conspiracy box without catching them in one dramatic moment. He recognized the shift and cut his exposure accordingly. He refused to place himself in rooms that looked like a photograph someone would want, refused to repeat routines that made surveillance easy, refused to inflate his comfort with loud displays. Younger men called that old-fashioned. He called it survival. Then came the case that stepped past suspicion. In 1967, a federal court convicted him of conspiracy connected to a string of bank robberies, not for walking into lobbies, but for allegedly directing people and timing. Reports on the sentence used a phrase that landed like a thud: half a century. The time number, rounded and heavy, felt designed to define him forever. He denied the premise on day one and never revised the denial. Inside, he organized his life into pieces he could control. Exercise, reading, conversation guarded by courtesy. He kept up with the city through visitors and letters and learned to treat the calendar like a sparring partner. He didn't rage at it. He outlasted it. His path back outside in 1978 dropped him into a city transformed by the very statutes that had helped secure his conviction. Parole conditions trailed him everywhere. Association rules meant that someone else's history could pull him under. He slipped more than once. A meal with the wrong shoulders at the next table. A wake where an old acquaintance hugged him too long. Incidents like that sent him back in on violations. Each time he returned without spectacle, resumed the unremarkable routines that made time survivable, and waited for another release. He had lived by schedules for decades. He simply added a new kind. Meanwhile, his professional orbit didn't disappear. Owners still believed his presence cooled rooms. Runners still believed his advice kept them out of headlines. Agents still believed his reach touched gambling books, loan collections, weekly payments from nightlife, and leverage where unions met contractors. He kept repeating the line he had used since the 1,940 seconds. He wasn't violent. He wasn't reckless. The government confused reputation with proof. Investigators countered with documents, charts, and informants. The argument became the background music of his life. His family story entered the foreground in ways that would have broken many. One son engineered a complex fuel tax scheme in the 1,980 seconds that functioned like an industrial pump, drawing money through paper companies and sham routes. That son later renounced the life, built a speaking career, and pointed to his father's world as a warning. Another son struggled for years with heroin, and then agreed to cooperate with the FBI. He wore wires, met his father, and recorded conversations that would become central in a courtroom decades after the first conviction. Those recordings captured the language of his world ellipses and hints, phrases that avoided directness because directness was a liability. Defense lawyers attacked the son's reliability, pointing to addiction and motive. The tapes nevertheless helped push jurors toward guilty verdicts in a late-life case. The timeline from that point is stark and simple. Convicted in 2010 on racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion, counts connected to payments from Manhattan area nightlife businesses and loans that carried harsh terms, he received a sentence in early 2011 that would have made most men surrender to the idea of dying inside. He didn't stage a drama. He adjusted again. Press accounts and federal records noted, with amazement, that he became the oldest inmate in the system. He treated the distinction like a trivia fact that had nothing to do with the day he still had to finish. He came home in 2017, outlasting the forecast. Cameras found him briefly, more fascinated by the milestone than by the particulars of allegations. He gave them a few lines about being grateful, and kept the rest of his thoughts where he had always kept them. He resumed a life of measured errands and careful courtesy. He sat by windows and watched a city he had known in 5 different eras keep reinventing itself without changing its core energy. He had kept pace with all 5. When writers step back and try to chart his life, they often default to categories. On the legal side, the 1,967 bank robbery conspiracy, conviction with a sentence measured in decades, multiple returns to custody for association violations while on parole, and the 2010 racketeering conspiracy and extortion conviction that relied on recordings, including material supplied by his own son. On the allegation side, gambling books run with precision, loans designed to harden influence, regular payments from nightlife and adjacent businesses, and pressure points within certain unions and contracting channels. On the public side, a cultivated manner that made him memorable, quiet, neat, unfailingly formal, and a reputation that moved ahead of him like a herald. Across all of those lanes sits a stubborn fact. No court ever secured a violent conviction with his name on it. Agents and prosecutors argued that fear can be delivered without a visible mark, and that responsibility can be inferred from context. He kept his answer spare. If the state could prove as much as it claimed, trials would look different. That stalemate between courtroom results and investigative narratives followed him to the end. He mattered inside his organization because he embodied a particular style. He rewarded punctuality, thrift, and discretion. He discouraged people who loved the mirror. He trimmed the circle of anyone who confused movie dialogue with discipline. He taught younger associates that a tidy life is a defensive wall. Those who listened tended to last. Those who didn't tended to vanish from the payroll. And, eventually, from public memory. His own endurance became the sales pitch for his method without him ever having to sell it. The broader city kept changing names for the same pressures. In the 1,950 seconds, nightclub owners paid for peace. In the 1,980 seconds, venues paid for security. In the 2000s, the language turned into consulting or keeping headaches away. Whatever the label, the outgoing money bought predictability, and predictability is valuable when margins are built on full rooms and smooth nights. Prosecutors called those streams extortion. He called them arrangements that everyone understood. The question of consent, whether a business truly feels free to decline, sat at the moral center of almost every case involving him. Courts answered that question more than once. In private moments that visitors describe, he didn't claim heroics. He talked about food, about a piece of music he had liked, about a neighborhood bakery that had changed owners twice and somehow kept the same crumb. He asked after children and grandchildren. He joked about learning to use a newer phone. He remained formal with strangers, warm with waitstaff, and restrained on any topic that could be summarized by a transcript. Decades of surveillance make people concise. He had refined that concision into a personal style. Sometimes myth tried to swallow him. Stories about extreme precautions and celebrity friendships grew in the telling. He neither embraced nor swatted them away. He knew myth can be a shield and a magnet at once useful, until it attracts heat you can't afford. His choice was to act as if myth belonged to other people. He kept his eyes on small daily practices. Show up, stay calm, leave on time. Keep the slate clean even when the file isn't. Those habits looked modest. They were the spine of his survival. He died in 2020 after a run that stretched from the age of pushcarts to an era when a car arrives because a signal leaves your pocket. The city filled the day with the same energy it would have had if he'd never walked its sidewalks. Yet anyone who studies the internal history of its hidden economies will keep returning to his name because it links eras that otherwise feel disconnected. He is a thread that passes from the tenement stoops of his boyhood to the velvet ropes of his last prosecution, tying together styles of influence that look different but operate on the same logic. Order costs, and the people who can deliver it tend to claim a fee. What you take from his life depends on where you stand. For some, he proves that elegance can hide exploitation, that tidy manners can mask structural pressure that drains communities. For others, he stands as a model of restraint in a culture that rewards noise, a reminder that self-control can be armor strong enough to deflect almost anything but a well-built case. Both readings can be true at once. The documentary record is clear on the convictions. The human impressions are varied and stubborn. He spent a lifetime living in that gap. He would likely have shrugged at that discussion. He valued tomorrow more than verdicts on yesterday. He believed that how you carry yourself under pressure is the only thing you can really own. He invested in that, day after day, year after year, until the calendar itself seemed to nod at him in respect. In a world that devours men who chase the wrong kind of attention, he gave himself the best possible odds by refusing to chase. He let time decide, and time reluctantly, then finally did. He spent those last years practicing ordinary joy with the same care he once brought to complicated days. A chair by a window, a clear morning, a cup balanced on a saucer, a family voice in the next room. Those details carried more meaning than all the headlines stacked in a file. Reporters still called with questions about eras and cases. He deflected with manners. Neighbors nodded in hallways, aware they lived near someone whose name had been a byword for a century of New York history. He answered with a gentle smile and let the elevator close. Memory organized itself for him in places, not speeches. Tenement blocks where laundry hung low over the street. A candy store that served as a betting outpost behind a rack of magazines. Pool halls where numbers traveled in murmurs. Later, booths in lounges where the music covered talk, and everyone knew where to look if they needed a quiet fix to a loud problem. Through all of it, one theme held: respect shown, respect returned. He wasn't chasing applause. He wanted rooms that ran on time. The biography beneath the myth is straightforward. Born in Italy in 1917 and raised in Brooklyn after his family brought him over. He grew up during hard years that demanded hustle. Drafted during World War II, he wore a uniform briefly before a discharge sent him home early, a departure that created its own lore. Back in the city, he aligned with older figures who taught him an approach that prized elegance over noise. Over time, federal files would connect his name to a suite of staples from mid-century rackets: illegal gambling, short-term lending at sharp rates, regular payments from nightlife businesses in exchange for stability, and influence around labor that guided who worked and on what terms. Those lines became the outline of his public reputation. That outline included a famous allegation that he altered his fingertips to complicate identification. He let that rumor live without confirmation, understanding how legend can protect and provoke in equal measure. It fit a narrative about a man who kept his hands off paper and his name out of obvious places. Whether true or not, The story traveled because it explained something people felt about him, that his caution went beyond ordinary habits into ritual. By the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, agents described him as an up-and-comer under Joseph Profaci and, later, a central player as the group that became known as the Colombo family settled into its hierarchy. The labels shifted over time: capable earner, senior figure, underboss. He never publicly wore a title. He didn't need one. Owners, runners, and intermediaries moved differently when he stepped into a room. He favored steady income over spectacle, preferred a docket of small, predictable returns to risky ventures that risked attention. That taste protected him through periods when television shows and committee hearings turned organized crime into a national storyline. Law enforcement's response evolved. Surveillance grew more precise. Recording technology improved. The racketeering statute let prosecutors stitch together patterns that once would have fallen apart as separate incidents. In that climate, restraint became the difference between gossip and indictment. He cut meetings short, changed venues often, and insisted on good manners as a way of eliminating chaos. Associates who couldn't control drinking or temper watched the circle shrink without complaint from him. He simply stopped answering their calls. Then came the case that stopped being rumor. In 1967, a federal jury convicted him of conspiracy tied to a series of bank robberies. Prosecutors said he provided logistics and leadership, placing the right people and organizing the after-work handling of cash. He denied every part of that portrait. The verdict still arrived, and with it a sentence measured in decades. The numbers sounded like the end of a life. The man who received them never raised his voice. He accepted transport and began a long stretch that would define his legend as much as the charges did. Prison didn't turn him into a storyteller. It made him more exact. He rose early, exercised, read widely, and spoke with courtesy to staff and fellow inmates. He carried himself as if each day's completion were a craft. Visitors brought him thin slices of the city, a new club on a familiar block, a bakery that still used rye flour the old way, a nephew's school recital. He filed those details away. He knew he would need them if the calendar ever set him free again. Freedom came with terms in 1978. Parole limited his movements and dictated whom he could see. In his world, where every corner held a potential acquaintance, those restrictions carried a quiet hazard. He crossed those lines more than once, sometimes at a wake, sometimes at a meal, and returned to custody for association violations. No complaints, no public fights. Back out again, he resumed a life of short meetings and longer walks, of nightclubs where the band took requests and doorsmen noticed how quickly tension left when he appeared. The 1980 seconds brought family chapters that complicated everything. Michael, the son who became a celebrity in his own right, built a fortune by exploiting fuel tax loopholes, then renounced crime, embraced faith, and turned into a high-visibility speaker about law, consequence, and personal change. John Jr., another son battered by addiction, decided to cooperate with the FBI. He wore wires, recorded conversations, and later testified against his father in a federal courtroom. To the older man who ran his life by loyalty, those turns struck at the structure he valued most. He did not campaign against his children. He kept his reactions private and held to his code without commentary. The organization around him convulsed through wars and prosecutions, especially in the early 1990 seconds. Leadership went in and out of federal facilities. Crews shifted allegiances. He maintained the same approach: dress well, arrive early, leave early, and don't attend gatherings that felt like newspaper photographs waiting to happen. Agents continued to link his orbit to gambling books, weekly collections, high-interest loans, and payments from nightlife owners who wanted smooth nights. None of that mattered as much to his late-life record as the case the government built in the 2000s. That final prosecution relied on hours of recordings gathered by informants and by John Jr. The tapes captured the elliptical language of a world trained to avoid clarity: hints, nicknames, half-sentences. Prosecutors added explanations, witnesses, and charts to translate those sounds into a narrative about regular payments from Manhattan clubs, loans that tightened faster than borrowers could manage, and the use of reputation as an instrument of pressure. Defense lawyers emphasized failing health and challenged the credibility of key witnesses. Jurors convicted him in 2010 on racketeering, conspiracy, and extortion counts. In 2011, a judge imposed a sentence that would have persuaded most people they would never see their front door again. He went back inside with a dignity that confused younger inmates who had never seen someone treat punishment like weather. Prepare for it, endure it, refuse to take it personally. In those years, he was frequently noted as the oldest inmate in the federal system, a record that fascinated the press and seemed to amuse the staff who dealt with him. He didn't lean into the attention. He just kept moving through his day, a walk on the track, a page turned, a polite nod at count. Release came in 2017, and the cameras that met him at the gate framed a picture that almost defied belief. A centenarian stepping into sunlight after a lifetime's worth of court dates. He thanked well-wishers, ignored baited questions, and returned to the rituals that made him feel like a human being rather than a headline. Coffee in the afternoon. A phone that rang rarely. Family visits that brought laughter to a room. A city that still moved as he remembered, even if the names on the storefronts had changed. His death arrived in 2020 after more than a century in motion. The obituaries emphasized the same mileposts. Brooklyn boyhood, wartime stint, rise within the Colombo family, 1,967 conviction tied to bank robberies, long sentence, cycles of parole and recall, a late-life conviction grown out of wiretaps and testimony, and a longevity that turned him into a symbol of a bygone style. Those pieces also repeated the boundary that had shaped debate about him for decades. No violent conviction ever stuck, despite a mountain of allegations about intimidation, fear, and worse. Supporters clung to that fact as proof of restraint. Critics called it a technicality born of the difficulty of turning whispered orders into admissible evidence. That dialogue will never close. What separates his path from so many others in the same line of work is how completely he leaned on manners as method. He showed that composure can be more powerful than volume, that routine can be strategy, and that if you plan to live at the edge of the law, discipline is oxygen. Those skills do not absolve the harm tied to the systems in which he excelled. Illegal betting doesn't just count numbers, it drains households. High-interest loans don't simply keep bars open. They bind owners to cycles they cannot escape. Payments for order don't just calm a room, they shift the cost of safety onto the vulnerable. Understanding his craft means confronting those costs without romantic filters. Yet a full account also includes moments that explain why people followed him. Waiters remembered a gentleman who always tipped and never raised his voice. Club managers remembered a problem solver who could diffuse a misunderstanding before it broke the night. Younger associates remembered a mentor who hammered 3 rules. Don't show off, don't drink on the job, and don't write down anything you can carry in your head. Those recollections made him human, in a conversation that often turns such men into cartoons. The city forged him, and in return he became one of the city's recurring myths. Each generation rediscovered his name and used it to talk about whatever worried them. Corruption, order, loyalty, betrayal, the glamour and rot lurking in nightlife, the meaning of honor, in a world that trades it for leverage. He rarely answered those interpretations directly. He understood that argument would outlive him and, in its way, keep him alive on paper. He just kept moving, a half step out of the crowd, as if the safest place to stand had always been just to the side of whatever people were looking at. If you map his life to its legal anchors, the pattern is clean. Mid-century allegations of gambling operations, loan sharking, protection payments, and labor influence fit neatly within the larger history of New York rackets. The 1,967 conviction for bank robbery conspiracy placed him in federal custody for years. Parole restrictions pulled him back inside multiple times when association rules collided with real life. The 2010 racketeering conspiracy and extortion case, built on recordings and witness testimony, especially from his own son, sent him back one last time. He left prison in his 100th year and died not long after, still formal, still private, still living by a code that had cost him decades and preserved his identity. What remains for anyone listening before sleep is a set of lessons that do not require admiration to be true. Style can carry you, but substance decides what you pay. Quiet is a tool only if you pair it with careful choices. Loyalty feels noble until it demands years you cannot get back. Discipline without ethics can look like grace, while it harms people you never see. He embodied all of that. He is proof that a person can be elegant and damaging, composed and costly, a gentleman in manners and a defendant on paper. Holding those truths together is the work of honest storytelling. He would not have asked for epilogues. He saved sentiment for music and family dinners. So let the end rest where his own habits left it. A polished shoe crossing a threshold without hurry. A nod offered instead of a speech. A city buzzing beyond the window. Same current, different bulbs. He lasted because he aimed to last, one measured day at a time. Whether that endurance reads as triumph or warning depends on the light you hold it up to. Either way, the shape of his life is clear now, and the noise around it has faded enough that you can hear the one part he always controlled, the steady rhythm of a man who kept his pace, while the street tried to make him run. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Sonny Franzese here, thanking you for walking with me through nearly a century of crime, loyalty, and silence. If this story kept you company tonight, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support truly motivates us to keep bringing you more interesting stories from the underworld. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the whispers of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.